chapter 12, verses 38 to 41. This is Jesus pointing really from Jonah to himself, speaking to the Pharisees. And some of the Pharisees and scribes answered him, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here." Amen. Amen. You may be seated. We are continuing on in our time of study through the book of Jonah, really starting the new year, thinking with this particular prophet, minor prophet, not minor in terms of value, but minor in terms of just the breadth of work here with the writing of this story, a small story where a great fish or a whale, you can decide which one you think it is, takes its place in the story. I think animals have a way of getting our attention, and they certainly do. It certainly does in this story. I know we got a dog not long ago, and his way of getting our attention is to bring in something he shouldn't have, and kind of walk into the middle of the room and look at us and kind of drop it, like saying, "I'm here, chase me with that flip-flop." And I think in a story like this, we can get overly fixated on the creature and miss out on the fact that God has a purpose for the creature being there. And it's interesting in the book of Jonah because you don't really have an extensive account of this miracle of a great fish, whale, what have you, swallowing a person whole and the person living. It's just told sort of matter of fact. And so there's a very short summation really at the beginning and at the end of chapter 1 and then the end of chapter 2. Verse 17 just says, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." And then in verse 10 of chapter 2, "And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land." That's it. You don't get an extensive description of what it was like, what the innards and bowels, and what kind of projectile came out of Jonah, all that crazy stuff that people would argue about. You just don't get that. And I think there are people that would be understandably skeptical that something like this could actually happen. And at least for me, where I'm coming from, and I'll just give this slight, I don't know what you call it, disclaimer, but I believe the resurrection is a fact, that God has the ability to raise life out of death in the person of Jesus. So in the acceptance of that, I have a much easier time accepting the miraculous this way. I mean, if you think about it, if you say to yourself, I don't really believe in the existence of miracles at all, because there's no real empirical data that could prove them, well, you still have to take that same burden and prove the non-existence of what's claimed to be a miracle. So in a way, the burden of proof is still on you too. We still have, I think, to deal with what's in this text, which is written as a historical account. It's not written as a kind of a fantastic story, because if that were the case, we would see Jonah as this fantastic figure, because he is called by God to do something pretty amazing. The word "great's" repeated 5 times in the first chapter. The one person that we don't see in this story that's acting all that great is one of the main characters in the story, besides God. It's an interesting story. Jonah is a very complex figure in this story. His high point really is here in chapter 2. But the real subject of the book is God himself. As we said last week, in chapter 2, verse 9, the entire book, I think, is summarized that salvation is from the Lord. Salvation belongs to the Lord. If you were going to put a banner over the book of Jonah, that's what you would say. You wouldn't say Jonah and the whale. You would say salvation is from the Lord. And then as the book unfolds in 2 halves, you have an illustration of that with the sailors in chapter 1. You have an explanation of salvation, or really an explanation of the gospel here in chapter 2. And then the book starts over again as the story continues with an illustration of salvation with the Ninevites, and then an explanation of salvation of really what the gospel is like in chapter 4 as you look at the character of God. So we're going to look at chapter 2. I think thinking of salvation as a theme, if salvation is from the Lord, then we need to cry out to him for it. If rescue comes from God, then it's incumbent on us to cry out to him for it. That's exactly what Jonah does here. There's three basic ingredients to understanding the gospel. And you can see it here. Number one, that sin causes separation. Separation from God. You can see that here illustrated in Jonah's life as he's asked to be thrown into the ocean, that his disobedience has taken him far from God now, and he finds himself at the bottom. It's about as far away as you're ever going to get, but it's really illustrative of the fact that sin has a way, storms attached to sinful behavior, which creates separation. So secondly, then, after we see that there's an intervention of a resurrected sense that happens by God in Jonah's life. And you start to see that now as the text moves from verses 5 into verse 6, 7, and 8. And then lastly, there's a question of how do you respond if we're separated from God and God has intervened miraculously and mercifully in a sort of resurrected sense. What are we supposed to do in light of that? And it's very, very simple. We're supposed to cry out to him with a voice of thanksgiving and faith, praising him for what he's done in our lives. That's exactly what Jonah does here. So salvation's explained in the second chapter of Jonah here as we look at it. Look at the first 6 verses here. Every act of disobedience comes with a kind of storm, a stormy separation. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deeps surrounded me. The weeds were wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought my life. You brought up my life from the pit, O Lord, my God. Disobedience leads to a separation. If you think about it in a broader sense, from the garden to this day forward, that's exactly how we understand life in terms of our worldview. There was a sinful act in the garden that led to an alienation and separation from God. And you see that again here in Jonah's life, at least in a moral sense, and then you even see it in a geographical sense. But this prayer highlights the fact that Jonah has now truly recognized the extent of what his disobedience means. We showed a slide last week of Jonah running from God. He's at Joppa, and he's called to go to Nineveh, meaning he's called to go east by about 500 or so miles. And he gets a ticket to go 2,500 miles in a westward direction to the southern coast of Spain. Now, it's just fascinating to me that when Jonah finds himself at that level of disobedience, that God doesn't say to him, fine, you'll never have me ever, ever, ever again. There's still this chance for a relationship. That even though the thing that he wants, he would rather die than go take the gospel to the Ninevites, God miraculously keeps him alive. And you'll notice in this text here, if you're looking at it, I don't know if it shows up in any kind of electronic version, but at least in a printed version in a Bible, it shows the text in a different font with a different layout, because Jonah's prayer is a compilation of Psalms. His prayer is expressed poetically. It's important to see that because the writer of the Jonah account is making sure that we understand that what is expressed by Jonah has scriptural truth attached to it. It's very rich when you start to break it down. And I can't go through every single psalm that is quoted here, but we can at least start by looking at verse 2, which is a quotation from Psalm 18. I started the service by reading from Psalm 18, the first 3 verses, but then what Jonah does is pick up the next section of Psalm 18, which is a psalm of lament, where David feels trapped by his enemies to the point of death. But God delivers him. from his enemies. And that same idea is picked up in the prayer of Jonah. This is what Jonah is feeling. Jonah is a prophet who would have known his Bible. This was written after that time that David would have said something like this. So Jonah would have understood, and it would have not have been out of the realm of possibility that he would have had large sections of Scripture committed to memory. And here comes the poetic expression of Jonah's prayer. But what's fascinating is, as Jonah is praying this, he too recognizes that there is a responsibility, not only on his own part, but the fact that God is sovereignly still in control even of his mess. So the mess that's been made is not a surprise to God. It's not out of the realm of possibility that a mess could happen in his life. In fact, he sees God still in control of what's happening. He's still working in spite of the mess. God hurled a storm because of Jonah's sin. Now his situation is one of extreme distress. His purpose here in the storm is to use this affliction to draw him near. That's what we start to see as the reader. His purpose is to make his prophet an actual follower. Which, when I wrote that, I started to really think about that. Someone who would profess to know the right answers, to actually believe to the point where it's life-changing what's happening. He's trying to make the prophet a follower. Once you realize that every affliction that you're going through is designed by God for that purpose, to not just make you a speaker of the word, but someone who actually believes it to be true for the purpose of glorifying God. Once you realize that's your reality in every storm that you face, it won't make the hurt come any less. But knowing his plan, knowing that he has the power to give his servant the ability, even miraculously, to endure through the storm, should hopefully give you some kind of comfort in the midst of your affliction. Think of Romans 8, 28 and 29 from an afflicted standpoint, that God works all things together for good, for his good purpose. Just to make you as a follower more Christ-like. He works all things across all of eternity in his wise and loving plan. He's taking that storm, that affliction in your life, and working it out toward his good purpose. What does that mean? He wants to make you, as a speaker of the word, an actual follower of it. So as he's doing so, he's using whatever means and whatever tools are necessary in that instrumentation to bring you to a greater sense of trust and dependence on him. And then you can really rejoice in the good that's produced out of the difficulty. Think about it from the perspective of a paraplegic like Joni Eareckson-Tada. She said, I really don't mind the inconvenience of being paralyzed if my faithfulness to God while in this wheelchair will bring him more glory. When God brings suffering into your life as a Christian, be it mild or drastic, he is forcing you to decide on issues you've been avoiding. Am I going to live in two worlds or truly devote myself to being like Christ? See, it's one thing for me to say this. It's another thing for a person who's been confined to a wheelchair due to a swimming accident to say it. But the point is still the same. God is bringing the storm into Jonah's life, which caused a kind of separation, but all of that is still a tool in his hands to bring him to a point of dependence. Jonah realized his sin had banished him, but it's commingled with hope. You see this in verses 2, 4, and 6. It's so important to see this. This really got my attention this week, because the last thing we want to do, I think, as we study the Bible as a group of people, is to walk out hopeless. Like, I feel like Jonah. I feel like I have sinned. I am the author of a storm that I know has caused a lot of pain. And there's nothing I can do to rectify it. There's no way I can switch the circumstances around. But when you read the book of Jonah, especially in verses 2, 4, and 6, you see that there is, in the midst of feeling like things are really messed up, almost beyond the point of no return, they're not. He says, and in verse 2, out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Sheol being like that place of just utter alienation from God. Out of the belly of that place, you heard. God still listens. It's not as if he's turned his ears to close mode, even though Jonah's done this. Verse 4, yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. Yet I shall look again, that there is the possibility for restoration, for being in God's holy presence. And then in verse 6, yet you brought my life up from out of the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. In other words, that there is access to God, even in the midst of disobedience. See, what Jonah is saying here is, as much as a sinner as I have been, it's not as if God doesn't still listen, and it's not as if he couldn't respond, and it's not as if the status that you find yourself in couldn't be changed. And you have to remember that there is unbelievable hope here in the midst of a person's life who said, I'm going to run the opposite way from God and create a huge mess for the people around me. God hears his cry. There's a possibility of being in his presence. That there is separation from God, that is real because of disobedience, but there's hope of reconciliation and enjoyment in his presence and fellowship forever. That is a possibility, even for you. Even for you. So then we see, not only does he bring, does Jonah's life and responsibility create a kind of mess like this, but God is still working. We see God faithfully and mercifully intervening to make reconciliation possible in verses 6 to 8. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever, yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. And then he starts to get a little preachy here. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. Yeah, Jonah, you would know that because you saw the guys who were doing that, tossing all their idols over the side of the boat. But I, with a voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. The point here of this passage is to not look at the sincerity of Jonah and to say, on the basis of the sincerity of Jonah, so God then is compelled to do something. As if Jonah's tears and vows and promises are the key that unlocks Jonah's situation and brings the intervention and reconciliation of God. The basis on which Jonah will be reconciled to God is the fact that God is faithful to listen to the cry of a sinner. That only God has the power to break the bolts over the doors that keep sin and death, to keep us within sin and death. Only God has that power, and it's on the basis of the fact that God can break that power, that God can open the door and release a person out of that cage. That's the basis on which we rest and have our confidence. But we might jump to the end of verse 9 and say, what I have vowed, I will pay. This is it. This is what I'm going to do for you, God, now. But the first thing we have to recognize here is that in the midst of Jonah sensing this complete banishment, only God has the power to bring up life from the pit. It's so important to see that. This banishment, again, is mixed with hope. If you think about what this banishment, if you think about it from the perspective of the garden, here's Adam and Eve. They are banished from the garden because of sin and disobedience, because they listened to the serpent, because they went after their own inclinations, because they decided that their ideas were better than God's commands. Once they come to that realization, they're banished from the garden. Remember, they're taken out of Eden. And there's an angel with a flaming sword guarding the way back into the garden. There's no way they're going back in. Boy, that feels a little bit vengeful on the part of God. There's no way you're going back in that garden, but it's actually hopeful. It's hopeful because the worst of all possible things could have happened to Adam and Eve. They'd gone back in and decided to eat from the tree of life in the current state of separation that they had from God. They would have been living life forever with alienation from God had they gone back into the garden and eat from the tree. So they had to be kept back from doing that very thing by having an angel with a flaming sword in front of the garden to keep them away. And who is it? Who is it that's able to take us back into the garden to eat from that tree? It's not going to be the first Adam, but the second Adam. The second Adam who will take the sword upon himself. who will go and take us there by the tree of life, which is a cross of wood. You see, when you think about the banishment that we have from the presence of God, we can feel hopeless, but there is hope, because God knows our current situation doesn't have to be the way it is forever. It certainly wasn't like that for Jonah. The sin and death here, resurrection and resurrection language explains how God's going to intervene. The effect of sin is something that can only be undone by God. Only He has the power to bring life out of death. And in the midst of our disobedience and unholiness, God in His holiness still provides a way to be with Him. His holiness, His perfection. Who among us can understand it and reside in its presence? Only if God makes a way. I don't know if this slide would end up in our sermon today. I didn't double check on it, but I was reminded of a young guy named Tyler Trent who passed away from a battle with cancer. He's a young guy in his 20s, and he had captivated the college football world for quite a while as he battled his cancer. But he battled his cancer as a Purdue fan, as a committed believer. When he was first diagnosed with cancer and was in the hospital, he wrote on his hospital door, there he is, he wrote on his hospital door, God is holy and I am not. Jesus saves, Christ is my life. Let that sink in for a second. He's 20 years old. He's thinking about what it will mean to get an education and take his place in the world. And here comes his diagnosis, and this is what he writes on his door. How do you write a thing like this? It's only when you come to the realization that God works all things together for His good purposes, that He is holy, that I am not, and that He has a purpose in this. It's amazing. I read a little bit about his funeral service in Indianapolis. Governor spoke. A letter was read by the Vice President of the United States. I mean, the kind of testimonial influence and impact will go far beyond 20-some years of his life on this earth. Coming to the realization that God is holy and that I am not, that Christ is the one who saves and renews, that He has the power only in Himself to bring life out of death. And ironically here, now Jonah is realizing what the sailors came to understand, what they did. They were the ones that were lobbing their things over the side of the ship. And Jonah now makes that part of his prayer. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. He starts to preach to himself first. What's he saying? That when you choose to put your hope in something that is completely powerless, you've chosen to extend and put all your time and energy into something that can't love you back, truly. Even if it's another person, can't love you the way God can. So you're forsaking the hope of steadfast love that can only come from the one who has the power to break your chains of sin and death. And you can see the powerlessness of these things if you were to take them out into Lake Erie and throw them in there. Eventually they would just bob up and down, lifeless. When we come to the realization that these things that we've been hoping in don't actually work, there's first a lot of anger, because a lot of these things that we put so much trust in, so much investment of time and energy, they just don't work anymore. And it seems like there's a lot of waste. But then there's a lot of hope. Because if you've turned your life over to Christ, you recognize that all the steadfast love in the world that I've ever been looking for is here right in front of me, now is here in me. Now I really have a chance to do the things I believe I was created to do. The only response to that, when that starts to take over your life, is faith and thankfulness. With a voice of thanksgiving, I recognize that God has repurposed my very body, mind, and soul for his good pleasure. The mouth that I used to curse God with, now I use to bless him. The hands that I used to make things and do things to serve myself, now I use to serve him. With every breath that I have, every breath will be a voice of thanksgiving and praise to God, like we just sang about. To say salvation belongs to the Lord or is from the Lord is to say that it's not from me, it's from him. It all belongs to him. It's a gift that I'm given, that I have to receive, first of all. And then once I receive it, I'm meant to share it. I was just thinking of the situations that I've been in lately, some opportunities missed. Talking with people who just give a little bit of they just crack the door open a little bit to talk about life. It's so difficult to get people to even start thinking about the larger realities of life, but it comes through disappointment. Just sitting with someone, thinking about some of the disappointment in their life. And I'm praying again for an opportunity to just open that door a little bit wider. We have to pray together for these things, that God would help us see when that door just starts to open, that whatever those things they've been relying on they're just not coming through anymore. They're just not there. And some of the disappointment and anger that is pushed off on other people and projected onto folks that have taken those idols away, then ultimately, after all that's been expressed, then what? That's the entree into the gospel. Sin brings disobedience. It brings a storm. When you rely on vain idols, they will eventually show that they're powerless to save you. But God has intervened, making life possible. And now it's up to us to cry out to him. The fact that Jesus used Jonah as an illustration, I think is so helpful, because when he's talking to the Pharisees, he's talking to a bunch of Jonahs, which is ironic to me. And some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." Teacher, we want a miracle on demand right now. That's it. Those are the terms. We want you to show us something. You say to God, I want you to do something. I need you to do something right here, right now. Or I'm just not believing. I'm just not doing anything. Wow. Where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? You were nowhere. But again, people, when they believe they have control over the entire world, including the religious world, and including the purview of God and what he's up to, will say such a thing. But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign." Jesus, that's not very seeker-friendly. You just said evil, Jesus. I'm offended. "But no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." You've heard of him, haven't you? "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Jesus was the messenger of God brought down to earth only to come back to life. Okay? That's the point of the story. Jonah is a pointer to Jesus. We understand that. But the audience that Jesus is addressing is so important to understand. Self-righteous people who look to God and say, "Hey, I'm here because of what I've given to you. The favor that I deserve is something that happens because of the things that I've done, living a good life. Now you're here, Jesus. You're upsetting the balance. And if you really are who you say you are, then you'll show me right now." You see what happens in your mind, how warped it gets? When you believe that salvation belongs to you, then you start to dictate to God how he must act to prove himself. Your little corner of Lake County. If Jesus doesn't do miracles on command, he doesn't say, "Okay, you're my keepers. Hang on just a minute. Let me do nothing up my sleeve." He doesn't do any of that. He says, go back and read the story of Jonah that probably many of you have committed to memory. See what comes after 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Once again, I'm going to rise up. The men of Nineveh at the judgment with this generation will condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here, standing right here. If you think about the magnitude of 120,000 people repenting in a moment, we're going to get to this next week, repenting over an 8-word sermon given by a still very reluctant prophet who doesn't even bother to go all the way into the city to give the message. If God has the power to change that many hearts in an instant, something greater than that is standing in front of you. And think about what a greater miracle it would be for even those self-righteous religious people to come to faith. I'll tell you, in a human sense, it's easier for the Ninevites. At least they would understand how far they were from God. But these people, these were church-going, good people. And they were far from God. And that, to me, is the irony of this story. That people who thought they were pretty darn good, who said, "Don't worry about me, Pastor. I got this thing figured out." That they could be far from God as the people that we would look at on any day of the week, whatever comes out of their mouth, to think that they're somehow farther from God than we are. It's astounding. The similarities have been drawn between the prodigal son. In fact, Tim Keller, who's a favorite of many, he wrote a book on the prophet Jonah called The Prodigal Prophet. And to think about the prodigal son running from God, just total debauched, profligate behavior, takes his inheritance, goes, says, I don't want anything to do with you, Father. You're dead to me. Give me my inheritance. Let me leave. Goes and squanders it all like a good Ninevite. Goes and just, gets rid of everything. And then he's back down eating a pig slop. And he's groveling. Now he comes back to God. Basically comes back to his father. And his father welcomes him with open arms because in humble dependence he realizes the total travesty and the bankruptcy of what he's done. And the son, the older son, is the one who's standing in the background saying, all these years I've worked with you, and you're going to take him back just because he's asking. One of the lessons is who's committing the greater sin here? Is it the son who squandered everything in sin, or is it the older son who's the good one, who stays around and helps out around the house and does everything that he ought to do? But that self-righteousness had pierced his heart. It had taken hold. And he didn't look at God as a merciful and gracious giver, a forgiver of sins. He looked at God on the basis of the fact that God returns favors. And when you think of Jonah and the Ninevites, there is a parallel to that. And that's the outstanding piece of this story that I think we'll end with, especially as we come closer to the communion table. And maybe we'll just make that transition right now, that as the ushers go and get the elements, we'll work our way there, thinking about these 3 core elements of the gospel. This is when we come to the table, this is what we remember. That each of us, when we are born into this world, we're born into sin. That the disobedience that happened in the garden with Adam and Eve has infected all of us. We all live in that alienation and separation from God. Through one man, death entered into the world, and death through sin. Therefore, all sinned. So if we think about it in that term, then sinfulness has invaded all of us. And the reconciliation that comes from God, then, that we just got a preview of from Jonah, doesn't come on the basis of our sincerity and the promises that we make, but it's based on what Christ has accomplished at the cross. That the only way back into the garden forever, for us to eat from the tree of life, is for the sword, the flaming sword that came from the angels, to fall on the head of Jesus. The seaweed that wrapped around the head of Jonah, but for Jesus was a crown of thorns that led to the bleeding of Jesus, a blood that needed to be spilled for our transgression. When we think about Jonah then pointing to Jesus, we think about what it means to call out to God by faith. Saved by faith. Saved by faith. Not saved by the sincerity of your faith, But faith only has a power as it rests in the object of it. So when you think about it that way, then faith's object is the most important part of this equation, but we need to do something in response. Many people that are sitting here have come to that point of response, and some haven't. And for the some who haven't, my heart's burdened for you, not in some kind of self-righteous sense. Just, I'm glad you're here. I want you to think with me. I want you to really think deeply about what it means to truly trust in God. Because the kind of stereotype that we might have is that a person who might be here might think, we might think of them as being completely out of place and this being a foreign sort of situation and environment for them. But a lot of people who are far from God are not those type of people. They're the type of people who might come here a lot and be very comfortable with God, but still would truly need to call out to God for salvation, because salvation belongs to the Lord, not to you in the sense of you're earning it. And so I think, as we come to the table, then this is a time to really take stock and really think about what salvation belongs to the Lord really means. If we've come to that point where we've truly cried out with open arms and said, yes, Lord, take my life. I'm confident in the fact that Jesus has accomplished everything. Then communion is for you. If you've not come to that point, and there's some question in your mind as to whether you're still serving idols and forsaking your hope, then we would just say let the communion elements pass by. Not in a judgmental sense, like you're the outsider and we're the insider, but we take this exercise seriously enough to say we want you to think about where you stand. And if you stand in a place where you're far from God, we don't want you to fake like I'm close to God. Because this isn't a religious ritual where everybody fakes it and then goes away thinking, well, I think I did something good for God today by taking communion. So the most important thing that we could say is if you've come to that place of recognition of what Jesus has done for you by faith, then please, by all means. If you haven't, then let it pass and think about it as we sit here in quietness. This might be the only quietness that you have all week long with a Bible open. I hope it's not, but it might be. But let's just do that together now, okay? Let me pray for the bread. We'll take the bread as individuals, and then we'll get the cup, and we'll proceed. Father, thank you for the bread of life that you've provided in Jesus. We pray that as we eat this now, that you will rescue us from thinking of this having any kind of magical effect, but that in remembrance you'll lead us to a greater sense of thanksgiving and trust, that we would indeed do that, be more trusting and more thankful. And we pray this in Jesus' name.